Okay, everyone, welcome to the video on chapter 22. They came to wither the flowers. A note before I start. Normally, this is actually one of my favorite classes of the whole semester. Normally you come in and I have printed the script to this presentation and everyone is assigned a part to read. And all of the slides that are in this presentation have quotes from chapter 22. So it's really important that you've already read chapter 22 and completed your QQMS assignment. When you're done with both of those things, this video is the next part of your work for chapter 22. Accompanying this presentation, Meg and I made a sheet with dots on it that represent all of the people that most historians agree lived in Central America at the time that Columbus came. And while we go through the presentation and we learn about the devastation of the smallpox epidemic, we start to cross those out, and it really gives you a visual representation of just the mass devastation of this epidemic in the New World. I don't know what your background knowledge was on the New World and Columbus and all of the germs that he brought from the Old World to the New World. And I want you to think about the difference in how people lived between the Old World and the New World. When you're thinking of the Old World, we really mean Europe. Think about the way that people lived in Europe. I mean, what do you know about England and some of the different kingdoms in that time? You should be thinking, well, they lived in dense cities, right? They lived in close proximity to their animals and close proximity to other people. And if you compare that to the New World were mostly bands of hunters and gatherers. You do know that there were some pretty sophisticated civilizations in Mexico. You should be thinking of the Mayans and the Aztecs, but they did not live in the same density that the people in Europe did. So the people in Europe, because they lived in such close proximity to each other and their animals, there were a lot of diseases that hopefully, if you've taken notes on the smallpox chapter, you understand that a lot of diseases morph from animals to humans, or I guess they jump from animals to humans. And because of that, because people live so close to their animals, a lot of the diseases were able to jump to humans. And then because the humans live so close to one another, the Old World had been dealing with different epidemics for centuries. And so there was a genetic resistance that was handed down in the people of Europe that the people of the New World had not been exposed to, had never seen. Their genetic history had never seen the diseases that the Old World had been coping with for centuries. And so you need to think about that. Obviously, Columbus unknowingly brought all of these pathogens over, but when he did, the New World had never seen anything like it, and it really explains a lot of the devastation that occurred because of that. So that's just some background knowledge for you to think of as you listen to this presentation and as you reflect on the chapter and think about the things that Preston was teaching you in chapter 22. It's really hard at this point not to connect what happened in this initial clash of the Old and New World. It's hard not to connect it to current events. So in your discussion board, I encourage you to do that and think about how epidemics are still impacting our global world and what that means in our more modern age. So that's something you can be thinking about as you move to the discussion board after this presentation. So again, this presentation is just different slides. It gives you a visual representation of some of the things that Columbus was doing and some of the things that Preston wrote about in chapter 22, and all of the quotes come directly from the chapter. 1493, Columbus's second voyage was aimed at subjugation, colonization, and conversion. 17 ships sailed carrying 1,500 men and livestock, including horses, cattle, dogs, cats, pigs, chickens, and cattle. These 17 ships also carried pathogens the New World had never seen. If you need to pause the presentation at this point, hopefully when you were reading chapter 22, you looked up words like subjugation, colonization, and conversion. If you didn't, it might be a good time now to Google that and see what those mean, especially tied into Columbus. It's important you understand all of these ideas. The New World was like a vast tinder-dry forest waiting to burn, and Columbus brought the fire. There came among the Indians such illness, death, and misery that of fathers, mothers, and children an infinite number sadly died. 1/3 of the population died in the 2 years from 1494 to 1496. The population for the island of Hispaniola went from 500,000 in 1492 to 0 100 years later. Disease alone did not kill all of these people. Forced labor, starvation, cruelty, murder, rape, and enslavement contributed to the deaths. The first epidemics were most likely influenza, typhus, and dysentery. Later, measles, mumps, yellow fever, malaria, chickenpox, typhoid, plague, diphtheria, whooping cough, tuberculosis came, but the worst of them all was smallpox. There are no records of the early epidemics. The real apocalypse was yet to come. We know that smallpox arrived in December of 1518 to Hispaniola. It spread to Puerto Rico in January and to Mexico by September of 1519. The death rate was 90 to 95%. Smallpox is the cruelest disease ever to afflict the human race. It usually starts like the flu with headache, fever, and body aches, and then it breaks out as a sore throat and soon spreads into a body rash. As the disease develops, the victim often experiences frightful, hallucinatory dreams and is racked by a mysterious sensation of existential horror. The rash turns into spots that swell into papules and then fluid-filled pustules that cover the entire body, including the soles of the feet. These pustules merge and the outer layer of skin becomes detached from the body. The skin turns a deep purple or takes on a charred look and comes off in sheets. The victim often bleeds out, blood pouring from every orifice in the body. Friar. It was a dreadful illness, and many people died of it. No one could walk. They could only lie stretched out in their beds. No one could move, not even able to turn their heads. One could not lie face down or lie on the back, nor turn from one side to another. When they did move, they screamed in pain. Many died from it, but many died only of hunger. There were deaths from starvation, for they had no one left to care for them. There are numerous accounts of European explorers arriving in a village for the first time, only to find everyone dead, the house full of rotting, pustule-covered corpses. Smallpox helped Cortez defeat the Aztecs. In 60 days, smallpox killed half of the 300,000 residents of one Aztec city. As the Spanish marched into the city, one observer wrote that the streets were so filled with dead and sick people that our men walked over nothing but bodies. When the Christians were exhausted from war, God saw fit to send the Indians smallpox. The Indians saw clearly that disease decimated them while largely sparing the Spanish, and they concluded that they had been cursed and rejected by their gods. By 1543, the Indian people of the Caribbean islands, Cuba, Jamaica, Hispaniola, and Puerto Rico had become extinct. 6 million people dead. 10 years after smallpox, another dreadful pandemic swept the New World, measles. It killed 25% of the affected population. Half the population of Honduras died between 1530 and 1532. The pre-conquest population of Honduras was about 600,000. By 1550, only 32,000 native people remained. This is a population collapse of 95%, a staggering statistic. Mosquitia was most likely invaded by disease between 1520 and 1550 by two pathways, trade and slaves. As disease wiped out early captives, the Spanish raiders went deeper into the countryside to find replacements. If we follow this hypothetical scenario to its conclusion, then sometime in the early 1500s, several epidemics of disease swept T1 in close succession. If the mortality rates were similar to the rest of Honduras and Central America, about 90% of the inhabitants died of disease. The survivors, shattered and traumatized, abandoned the city, leaving the cache of sacred objects behind as a final offering to the gods, ritually breaking them to release their spirits. There was then no sickness, they had no aching bones, they had no high fever, they had then no smallpox, no stomach pains, no consumption. At that time people stood erect, but then the foreigners arrived and everything fell apart. They brought fear and they came to wither the flowers.